session on ADAPT, the Adaptive Defensive and Protective Tactics Program. The title of the session is a new evidence-based model for law enforcement use of force training. Next slide. My name is Dr. Jonathan Wender. I'm the ADAPT Program Director and the President and CEO of Polis Solutions. I'm joined this afternoon by Don Gula, our National Training Director, who's overseeing development of the ADAPT curriculum, and Professor Joel Suss, ADAPT Senior Researcher, whose primary responsibility is ensuring the effective integration of scientific findings and research into our efforts. I'd like to turn the session over now to Deborah Mayer from the Bureau of Justice Assistance.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Hello, I'm Deborah Mayer, and I am a policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance. At BJA, we strive to provide the most current resources, information, training, and technical assistance to you at no cost, to you and to your agencies. Within BJA, I lead our Officer Safety and Wellness portfolio through our Valor Officer Safety and Wellness Initiative. The project you'll be hearing about today is part of this initiative and is being done in partnership with Polis Solutions. With Polis, we are researching what is being done in the field of defensive tactics and use of force, with really the mission of keeping you and our community safe and well. We believe what we're doing here hasn't been done before nationally. We are incredibly excited about the work and about what we'll be able to provide you and your agencies at the conclusion of this work. I want to thank our speakers today, Jonathan, Joel, and Dawn, for your time and dedication to this project. And I also want to thank you for joining us today and for all that you do. May you be safe and may you be well. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Deborah. We are enormously grateful to you and to BJA for your funding and support of this critically important effort. We understand that we have a critical task that's been entrusted to us, and we look forward to continuing to make progress on the ADAPT project. For the folks who've tuned into this session, thank you very much. Please remember this is a Simulive session. So at the conclusion of the remarks from me and Joel and Don, we're going to have live Q&A. So please be sure you participate in that. We want as much input from the audience as we can get and look forward to hearing from as many of you as possible after the session. We've got three core objectives that we'd like to cover today. First, we're going to give you a strategic overview of the ADAPT program. Joel is going to talk about some key findings from ADAPT national surveys that we completed late last year. And then Don is going to take you through progress we're making on developing a new evidence-based model for teaching defensive tactics and use of force decision-making. Next slide, please. Some of you have heard about the ADAPT program, but just to begin with a high-level overview, ADAPT stands for Adaptive Defensive and Protective Tactics. As Deborah already explained, the ADAPT program is funded by the U.S. Department of Justice, BJA, under the Valor Initiative. Our mission is to go back to the drawing board and rethink how we teach officers to make use of force decisions in a manner that integrates the best of decision-making science and psychomotor skills. We're going back to the drawing board because we know from research, we know from our own surveys that the way we're teaching officers to make use of force decisions and to actually apply techniques on the street is simply not effective. Current training programs are not as safe for officers or for the public as they could or should be, and we are here to try to improve on that reality. The outcome of ADAPT will be a training model that is intended to be scenario-based and usable by an agency of any size. I want to highlight upfront and early, ADAPT is not meant to be one more system to replace the myriad systems out there. ADAPT rather is meant to provide tools to agencies to integrate their current best practices using our research, using our methods, but also drawing from what they know internally works for them and drawing on their own policies, procedures, and governing statutes and case law. Next slide, please. The heart of ADAPT is an effort to think of better ways to develop expertise among the law enforcement workforce. Expertise, as we understand it, drawing on a wide body of research on decision-making and high-stakes performance, expertise is the integration of exceptional skill and discipline. We know from research, our own included, that when officers are confident and skilled, they are less likely to escalate force. They are less likely to be able to control themselves, to use verbal skills, and to respond adaptively to changing conditions around them. Most important, we know that expertise cannot be developed and learned in silos. And unfortunately, the predominant training model in law enforcement for use of force, defensive and control tactics is a silo model. So ADAPT, more than anything else, is about breaking down those silos and taking an integrated, holistic, evidence-based approach to teaching officers how to size up situations, how to determine a course of action, and how to execute on that course of action in the most safe, lawful, and ethically sound manner possible. Next slide, please. The current operating environment is one with which everybody participating in this session is all too well familiar. We are facing a level of tension between police and communities that is as high as it has been in over half a century. We're facing the challenges of COVID, which are now over a year old and are impacting everything from the mental health and wellness of our officers and their families and their communities to budgets. The impact of COVID, I think, is impossible to overstate and is looming large over the conversation around how we can train officers in a fundamentally hands-on skill in an environment where hands-on training has been so profoundly restricted and limited. We're facing growing threats to officer safety around the country. We're facing extremist actions and hostility at a level we haven't seen in many years. We're also facing unscientific restrictions on force options. In the aftermath of controversial tragic events, we're sometimes seeing a call to restrict what officers can do in various situations. We need to think through how to leverage evidence and science to ensure that we are respectful of community concerns while also ensuring the safety of officers and the public and proceeding in a manner that doesn't leave officers without options to control people safely. We are dealing with financial and health constraints on training that I already talked about. And most important, with profound implications for both officer and public safety, we have officers all around the nation who are confused and afraid and hesitant to act at street level. And that is translating into unnecessary injuries and fatalities among both the ranks of law enforcement officers and members of the communities they serve. Next slide, please. The current state of defensive tactics training has some profound limitations that we're working hard to rectify with ADAPT. As I already mentioned, many departments rely on a silo model, which fundamentally undermines processes of learning and performance. When we only teach isolated skills, when we only focus narrowly on technical proficiency, we are not allowing officers to develop the capacity for adaptive response, which is the foundation of expertise in any domain of practice. We also need training to be operationally realistic. Too many defensive tactics training programs are driven by an underlying system rather than by the reality of the street. And when agencies are beholden to the boundaries of a system, they're artificially limiting the training environment and process in a manner that unnecessarily leads to officer and community member injuries. We are not training in a manner that leverages use of force data. Not least of all, we are collecting millions of hours of body-worn camera footage in the United States every year. We need to think about more systematic ways to leverage that data. And in fact, we're doing so in ADAPT using our Patrol Expert software that we previously built for BJA under the T3 program. Defensive tactics training is not happening often enough. It's not financially sustainable, and it's often driven by crisis rather than by a systematic outcomes-based model of improving performance. We're also emphasizing self-defense over self-control, safe control rather. While it's important for officers to be able to defeat attacks, overwhelmingly, use of force situations involve the safe control of suspects, and that's where we need to focus our energy. We also need to think about balancing the focus in defensive tactics training so that we are shifting our energy to detecting and mitigating threats early on, rather than putting all of our effort into preparing officers for rare events that most of them will never see. So while it's important to give officers a capacity to function in those high-risk, low-frequency situations, we know from research that most lethal encounters begin at a low level of force and conflict. So the sooner officers can learn to detect and mitigate those threats, the more lives we can save among both the ranks of law enforcement officers and the public. Next slide, please. The ADAPT program is taking a data-driven approach. We are trying to identify new ways to integrate use of force data with training. As I already mentioned, we're trying to think through new ways of systematically using body-worn camera data to improve training. One of our pilot efforts with the state of Pennsylvania, with the Pennsylvania State Police, involves building video-based decision-making exercises that can then be pushed out to the workforce to measure and improve the way officers perceive threats and determine appropriate courses of action. We're using some new technologies to test out this process. Some long-term trends that I already briefly touched on. Most use of force involves high-frequency events. Walking up to people who have to be arrested, close quarters contacts, close quarters interactions. Most lethal encounters begin in those contexts at a lower level of threat. So the takeaway message for us is that the sooner we can detect threats and mitigate them, the more lives we can save. Next slide, please. Before I turn the conversation over to Joel, I just want to mention our pilot agencies to whom we're enormously grateful. We're working, as I already mentioned, with the Pennsylvania State Police. We're working as well with the New York State Police, with the San Francisco Police Department, with the Haltom City Police Department in Texas, and with the South Carolina Criminal Justice Academy. Each of these agencies has generously agreed to work together with us to pilot some of the training methods we are developing in consultation, not just with these agencies, but with a wider pool of subject matter experts around the country. So in the months ahead, all of you on this session and BJA will see a mix of hands-on and digital training methods intended to improve the way we teach our officers to size up situations involving the actual or potential use of force and how officers respond to those situations. With those remarks in mind, I'd like to turn the conversation over to Joel to give you some thoughts on our surveys and what they mean.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. So at Polis, we conducted 2 very comprehensive national surveys about defensive tactics. And what I've got here today is just a snapshot, an overview of those. There's going to be much more detail coming in the future. And so one focused on defensive tactics instructors, and then a second survey, separate survey, focused on regular line officers. So it's important to note that very few things like this have been done before, ever. In 2000, there was a study on line officers that was mainly focused on California. More recently, there was a survey done by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement with line officers only. And so here, what we did, we separately surveyed defensive tactics instructors and line officers. And for the defensive tactics instructor survey, we got a good spread of officers from and instructors from the United States, as well as some international respondents. But for the line officer survey, we got a really good number of responses, as you can see. But I have to note that this is largely due to one big agency in Pennsylvania, which is disproportionately represented in the survey. That agency was able to get a large proportion of their officers to complete the survey. For that, we are incredibly grateful. And based on that agency's ability to get support and buy-in for the survey, we've decided to enlist their assistance for other parts of the ADAPT project. I should also mention that both surveys were opened at the end of August 2020. So that's after COVID started and after the events of the summer of 2020. So let's start with the defensive tactics instructor survey. Before I get to some highlights, just let me say that we covered many areas. And again, this is just a snapshot that we're providing here today. But we covered things like the instructors' background in law enforcement and in martial arts and defensive tactics, details about the agency that they work at, how often they instruct. Do they instruct only law enforcement, or do they instruct, for example, corrections as well? Do they only instruct recruits, or do they do in-service defensive tactics training as well? What kind of training they conduct, as well as questions about training safety and safety equipment. Okay, so we asked instructors how frequently they deliver in-service training. And the biggest response category was annually at 40%. So we know that in general, there is limited time for training in law enforcement, but it's hard to imagine how officers can maintain a level of proficiency with just annual training. Compare this to professional sports, right? It would be unthinkable to tell a professional sports player that they could only train once per year and be expected to perform at a really high level. So next, we asked instructors whether they combined firearms and defensive tactics skills in their training. So only about 63% said yes, and around 37% said no. This is concerning because officers need to be able to adapt to different situations and even transition between different force options within a given incident. But also think about it this way. 63% said yes, but we don't know exactly what that looks like. It might be that combined training to some instructors might just be an officer who wears a replica firearm while they do defensive tactics training. That's not the same as actually combining those skills and working them together at the same time or in a given incident. But we don't have clear data on that. Okay, next slide, please. Yep. We asked instructors whether defensive tactics training includes role play scenarios and reality-based training. So most said yes at around 90%, and that's really good. But what we don't know is how often that is done and what that kind of training looks like. As you can imagine, role play scenarios could vary between very simple, quick situations to more elaborate scenario training. In regards to this type of training, we also need to think about whether they are done for assessment or for learning purposes. For example, doing role play scenarios for the first time toward the end of an academy, more as a test, is the opposite of what a scientific approach to training would suggest would be an effective method. Really, these types of situations should be learning events rather than just testing events. They're really complex and they're hard to deal with, even for experienced officers. And so think about it this way. Many trainees get put into role play scenarios and they never get to see an example of what good performance looks like. In sport, you can go online and you can watch world champions do what they do. You can see how they look like when they perform at a really high level. You can probably even get access to training footage. But how many opportunities are afforded to law enforcement trainees to try things out, to make mistakes, to get feedback, and then to improve and get things right? Guaranteed that the sports people that we know and love have reached the level of performance that they have only because they had opportunities to do challenging things in training and receive appropriate coaching. If you saw their training performance, you'd see lots of imperfect performance because that's the learning part of it that leads to the amazing performances that we see during games. In law enforcement training, too many times we see instructors say to a trainee, "Oh, you did this scenario, you got shot. You know what? Don't let that happen again next time." That's not learning. That's not what effective learning comprises of. Okay, so next we asked instructors whether they have a way to measure officers' performance in training. About 45% said no. That's concerning because if you can't measure or assess something, then how does someone know where they stand? Or how do they work out if they're improving? So if instructors don't have a way of measuring performance, then rest assured that the trainee doesn't know what they're aiming for. They don't know what good performance looks like. Let's think about this from another perspective. maybe your agency has a way of scoring or rating performance, but what exactly are they rating? Are they rating how well someone does a particular technique, like a front kick or an armbar or a block? Or are they trying to measure things like decision making, communication, situation awareness, and adaptability? Those are the kind of things that really need to be measured, rather than just how effective, or does someone hit on specific points when they're doing a particular technique. And before I move on to the line officer survey, I'd like to highlight one final thing that the instructors said. We asked instructors to rate whether officers are hesitant to use force, and even when it's reasonable and appropriate to do so. And a majority agreed, or strongly agreed, with that statement. They said that many of the officers were hesitant to use force when reasonable and appropriate. And given the timing of the survey after the summer, it is perhaps understandable that instructors are dealing with this situation. The thing that's concerning about this is that we want officers to be judicious in their use of force, of course, because using excessive force brings a whole range of problems. But being hesitant to use force when it's justified or necessary can also be problematic. Using the appropriate amount of force at the right time during an incident may prevent things from getting out of hand and leading to a situation where officers now may have to use a higher level of force than they would have otherwise. Okay, next slide. So now we're focusing on the line officer survey. And we asked about the frequency of DT training, just as we asked the instructors. And the majority of line officers said that they only receive defensive tactics training on an annual basis. Clearly, that's not sufficient to retain, let alone develop skills. And this is not a surprise. This is something that we know, but it's kind of striking how infrequently officers get defensive tactics training. We asked whether officers had the chance to do additional training at their agency over and above any mandatory defensive tactics training. And about half the officers don't even have a chance within their agency to do more training if they wanted to. That means that if they wanted to do more training, they'd have to do it outside their agency and probably invest their own time and money in going to outside courses or martial arts training that may be useful for their law enforcement career and law enforcement situations, but it also may not be targeted to that. So someone might go and do martial arts training outside, but that may not necessarily be targeted at their performance in law enforcement situations. Okay, we asked how frequently they use force while carrying out their duties. And the response was pretty infrequently. But we know that when force is not used appropriately, there can be big consequences on many levels. So there really has to be a balance between the frequency with which officers have to use force and the impact of negative outcomes. So there's this trade-off, of course, they use force relatively infrequently. Does that mean that they should only train to deal with use of force situations infrequently? No, clearly that's not the case, because you want to make sure that they get it right. And just because these situations happen relatively infrequently doesn't mean that you should train relatively infrequently. These situations can turn bad and can have negative outcomes if not handled appropriately. So that tells us that performance in this area is really important, and training once a year probably won't support effective performance in use of force situations when they happen, even if they happen infrequently. Next slide, please. Okay, we asked officers how often they come into contact with people carrying an illegal firearm. They indicated that that's pretty infrequently, and 28% said that it was less than once per year, and that was the largest response category. I guess that's kind of a good thing. We asked about training and injuries during defensive tactics training. 19% of officers reported being injured while taking part in defensive tactics training. That's relatively high. That's 1 in 5 people reported getting injured. And if you think about it, this might be one reason why many officers often don't look forward to defensive tactics training. If you compare it to firearms training, they know that if they go to the range to practice their firearms skills, they've probably got a lower chance of being injured than if they come to defensive tactics training. And that's a situation that shouldn't be the case. And officers don't just get injured in training, they also get injured during use of force incidents on the street. And we found that about 1/3 of officers reported being injured during a use of force situation. So finally, we asked about how their most serious injury occurred, and that's injury that occurred during a use of force incident on the street. And 45% said that this occurred through being intentionally assaulted by an unarmed subject. And this really speaks to an officer's ability to manage situations and anticipate the likelihood of higher levels of resistance from a subject. They need to train to control unarmed suspects. This speaks to the level of resistance that officers encounter during training. In training, are they mostly confronting unrealistic situations where they get to win, in quotation marks, easily? Or are they dealing with realistic levels of resistance in training, which is what needs to happen? Realistic levels and realistic situations. And obviously, this is the flip side of training injuries, right? There has to be a balance between learning to deal with realistic levels of resistance without causing undue injuries in training, because you want people to be able to train relatively frequently, but to be able to train and not get injured so that they can go back on the street and, do their duties to the best of their abilities. And so what we're really talking about, and how this will feed into what Don is going to talk about, is training really needs to be adaptive in nature. And we're not trying to push anything that is telling officers or instructors to use specific techniques. The ADAPT project is really technique agnostic. I really see it as an overlay on existing defensive tactics training. Use whatever tactics or train whatever techniques that you like, but what instructors should be doing is following some core principles in their training to make sure that that training is realistic as possible, and officers are getting put in situations that force them or create the opportunity for them to grapple with the legal, physical, and cognitive aspects of a situation and have to adapt their performance to different situations, because every situation that they encounter on the street is going to be a bit different. And they need to be able to put their skills into practice in a given situation when they may not have encountered that exact situation before. So that's where the adaptive flexibility part comes in. And I'll hand over to Don now. Thanks.
Thanks, Joel. So let's cover a little bit about the ADAPT and what it will do to improve the officer's ability. One of the biggest parts is their ability to recognize resistance. And as a DT instructor for many years, if you're going to guess what the resistance is, especially once you've gone hands-on by visual cues, it doesn't last very long. So how do they recognize the type of resistance? Because that goes back to their policy and what justifiable use of force they're able to use. One of the biggest areas that we want to work on is the flow between force options, because with so many force options trained in silos, we see officers from body-worn cameras that are caught in one mode of force options, and they're not able to get out of that or flow backwards to a less level of force because they haven't had an opportunity to do that in training. ADAPT is going to stress having anchor control positions. So I would hold this to be almost like if you're treading water, right? A safe position you can get to to, one, wait for backup to get there, control the person, allow them to get a little bit more tired, but also protect your firearm, because in a lot of cases, especially with a single officer, it's difficult to control someone completely by yourself, especially depending on size, weight, age. So we're really trying to incorporate good control positions that they can get to that would match in multiple different scenarios. And to develop DT proficiencies by drills to skills. So drills to skills means if you're going to have an officer be able to flow from one tactic to another, they have to be able to drill and just not give them a 1 hour block on it and then move along to the next one. They're not going to learn that. So drilling could be incorporated through warm-up drills, but one of the basics is increasing the frequency of training and repeating the basic drills that will build more into skills. So just not once a year, but quarterly roll call training, getting and having people go through the basic concepts versus specific techniques. Okay, next. So most chiefs lack a DT knowledge. So as chiefs are in positions, they place a lot of trust in their DT instructors to develop curriculum, and until something bad happens and it ends up in court, and then they look backwards and saying, like, when did we start doing this? Or when did we take this technique? But chiefs have a tough job, right? They prefer to have a one system that makes it easier, and they actually probably prefer to have that once a year because it's one and done. They know how to manage it throughout the year, how much funds to put towards it. And one consideration is that DT instructors often teach what they like rather than what works for the average officer. So, and that's important to stress because how long did it take that instructor to get to that skill level? If they're spending a lot of time doing a lot of training, but what's the average officer going to do to maintain their skills? As Jonathan mentioned earlier, chiefs need to look closely at their defensive tactics program. I've talked to a lot of instructors that have swayed, especially for in-service training, to where the bulk of their in-service training is on self-defense training. So that's mostly punching, kicking, elbows, knees. Well, because the majority of resistance on the street is not punching and kicking, you can see it doesn't match up with what we need to get them better at, especially if that's the training they're getting year after year. Well, when they get into a situation where they can't control the person, it generally can push them towards a high level of force, especially if they're stressing the self-defense aspect in their training. And looking at smaller agencies, a lot do not have specific DT instructors, or they don't have time to send the instructors out to get the training to come back and be able to teach their officers even a yearly in-service update. So we need to make sure that we can focus on getting them simplistic tactics that they can be able to teach within their agency and in-service, because the majority of agencies across the United States are smaller agencies. So DT method systems are, most chiefs don't recognize where the DT programs come from. And again, they're depending on their DT instructors, and the systems are not evidence-based, right? And if they had a chance to go back and look at their yearly use of force to see what the frequency of use of force is, what's the resistance, they need to be basing their tactics on that year after year. Next. So combining experience and training. So the biggest thing that we lack in defensive tactics training is that we're driven more by just the specific tactics and training. But if you're trying to teach someone to do something that they could be fearful of, right, you have to make sure you incorporate an experience as part of that. So most DT systems focus on, we're going to teach you in the gym, now go out and use it in the street. Well, we need to reverse engineer that and look at what's happening on the street and make sure that what we're teaching matches. So, especially within law enforcement environment. So if we're having a lot of people resisting not getting out of a motor vehicle, right? Are we matching the training we're doing because everything's in an open area in the gym? it's not going to match up. So we need to make sure that it's realistic and it matches what's happening on the street. And integrating legal, physical, cognitive elements to be realistic. So just technique-driven block training is not effective because generally there's no threat to them, and their partner's going to allow them to get the technique, right? Because they don't want to be injured. So how do we take them and stress them out enough to where they can feel the resistance and gain the skills? That's what ADAPT's about. Next. So for years, defensive tactics has been kind of like teaching someone to swim on dry land. So we have them out of the water, we practice, okay, kick your arms, right? Make sure that you paddle, but we never allow them to get in the water, which adds more stress, right? It shows you the fear, and you really can see where panic can set in when they're not comfortable, but yet that's how we teach defensive tactics. So really, how do we take them from a basic walk to run? So example for swimming would be, we're going to get them in the water, let them experience the water. We get them in the shallow end, they can practice moving around it, they get comfortable with the environment, right? Versus the DT instructor that's an expert, or he's a water polo player, he's comfortable. Why don't you people like this? This is water polo, man. Everyone loves water, don't they? Well, it's not true. Really, we have to guide them along the way. And in most cases, if we can get the person to tread long enough to get back up there, to survive the encounter, to control the person, that's the best we can hope on, because the amount of time we spend, the frequency, and the amount of money we have is all limited within agencies. Next. So teaching situations, not techniques. So basic motor skill principles, and based on human performance, we know what we need to do. But remember, because every situation that a law enforcement officer is involved in can change or deviate from what we believe is going to happen. So scenario-centric model, and we talk about medicine has moved away from putting people in the classroom and just having them learn about one part of the body, right? We're going to talk about kidneys today. Okay, let's go through it. Well, that's not how a doctor needs to look at a patient. They need to look at the total body, what's happening. And in defensive tactics, the same thing's true. They need to look at every force option that can be used, because it can change from a low level non-resistance to someone grabbing onto your firearm. So they need to focus on deliberate practice and really decision making, because without knowing what the resistance is, sizing up the situation, knowing when it's time to back off and get other officers there, if you don't do it with some stress in a controlled environment, that's where we see officers panicking. And in most cases, when we see officers fearful, especially if there's a less lethal deployment, it's not effective. The next thing we see is the firearm comes out. So really working on decision making is key to everything. So really outcome-based, right? Follow the data. If I need to be able to move in and control a suspect that's not resisting, move them to a handcuff position, or take them down and handcuff them on the ground, that's what we need to focus on. So especially if we're looking for measurements of success, if the recruit can come in and take someone that's resisting, move out of the kill zone, move to a safe position, take them down to the ground, move them to a cuffing position, that's what we're calling outcome-based training. Not can the person do A, B, C, D, their hands in the right position, did they do this, this, and this. We can't follow a check the box, because as soon as it goes outside of the scenario that they think they're doing, that's where the officers get confused or fearful. Next. So team tactics is one area we want to focus on in a day, because if you look at a lot of the use of force videos, whether good or bad, a lot of them have multiple officers. And this is where you can clearly see that they're not working as a team together. In fact, in some cases, they're working against each other. And in some cases, that could even cause the death of the officers or serious injuries. But whose fault is that? Because most academies do not teach team tactics. It may be an afterthought, but basically it's a single officer tactic. They kind of control them. Well, when you see a situation that they know could be violence, most officers are going to call for backup. They have backup there. So why aren't we teaching good tactics? Because we need to make sure that a couple officers are better than the average suspect, right, to get into control, use force efficiently, because team tactics would work better, right, than just a single officer attempting over and over a technique that's not working at the time. So especially within some of the bad examples we've seen, the module will consider communication. Are they talking or are they yelling, right? Are we considering where to go next to the next move, or what direction? Are we taking them forward or are we taking them backwards? And we're trying to handcuff them, right, standing, or we're trying to take them to the ground. So communication, right, and it looks a lot better on video when people are communicating. And I use almost the analogy like a SWAT team. When you see them move in, there's multiple team or officers, it's a team tactics. They're communicating back and forth. Even when they come out of a room, someone says coming out because they want to let the other officer know they're coming out. Well, the same thing needs to be true to multiple officers. And that would go back to the scenario-based training at the academy, to where you give them a chance to struggle with someone and they're able to freeze it. And this is where the coaching and expertise comes in and says, hey, right here, take a look what you're doing. You're trying to take them forward. You're trying to take them backwards. Let's communicate, get on the same page, and decide which direction we're going to go. But you let them figure it out. And by giving them the reps that way, guess what? That's a likely situation they're going to run into out on the streets. Next. So the first module we wanted to start with is standing control to cuffing. It's a high frequency and source of danger and escalation. So because every officer needs to be able to move in and control a maybe beginning compliant, but where it goes sideways is when it becomes non-compliant. So we're really focusing on how to make them safe to move in, right? Even if the person's going to try to punch or kick them, but to get to a control position that's safe and be able to move to the other safe areas before we take them down. The template approach considers the legal, tactical, cognitive elements of each situation, and that's stuff that they need to actually talk about even during the DT class, because if while they're doing the low-level scenarios and one officer gets out of control and starts punching on another student because they're frustrated, right there, that's a teaching moment. Okay, let's consider it. Everyone in the class gets a chance to see it, and then we can continue on with the scenario. But versus down the road, the same officer on a body-worn camera, the same thing happens, that officer could lose their job. But being able to move out of the danger zone is critical, especially from the front position. And a lot of defensive tactics systems rely on one control position. Most of the time it's trying to get control of an arm. And we see that failing over and over. So we need to get to a better position that controls a subject in a greater variety of situations, but also remembering to integrate verbal and physical skills with that. Because just yelling over and over, stop resisting, but we're not telling the subject what we want them to do, right? It doesn't tell the other officers what's happening. So calm and confidence, giving them clear and concise verbal commands. And one of the areas that is very lacking in current defensive tactics is the ability for officers to grab and control. It's almost like an afterthought, is that, well, I know how to grab someone, but do you know how to grab someone that's resisting or someone that doesn't want you to grab onto them? So we flow from how to grab onto someone from different angles and how to move to what we call the tack wrap position, which is controlling the waistline area. And the benefit of the waistline area, especially from behind the person, is it can block where the likelihood of weapons, but it also reduces the chance of being assaulted because we've moved out of the kill zone. And then once we get to that position, are we going to take them to a standing cuffing position? Well, if I'm by myself, we may end up going to the ground. If I'm with another officer, we force the officer to come in, gain control of the other arm. So you can see in the scenarios, we walk them through to once control position or anchor positions are met, if there's another officer, we insert them into the scenario. Now they have to flow as a team to make sure that they can get the person to the next control position and get them to a cuffing position. Next. So this is an example of, we're really trying to use technology. So we're using motion capture to look at some of the drills, and that sometimes that's easier for people to learn by looking at 3D animations. So the one on the left, you can see kind of what we call the angles of survival, that most officers are doing everything, you know, from kind of that 2 to 10 o'clock position where the punching and kicking or danger is. But how do we move to a safer position? And the take on the left looks like specifically just one technique, but it can be used from multiple different angles to anchor the arm on the hip area before we decide what we're going to do next. So this is more of a tactic versus a technique. And then where do we go to from cuffing? Right, that would be next. All right, so next slide. So that concludes my part of the presentation. Jonathan, I'm going to take it back to you because I think at this point we would open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Don. Well, we're enormously grateful to all of you who took the time to participate in this session. And we're now going to start the Simulive, and we're happy to entertain your thoughts and comments and look forward to hearing from you, as many of you as possible. Our contact information is below. Be well, be safe, and thank you.